Hi, Michael. I'm really excited to have you here to talk about Owen Barfield's book, Speaker's Meaning, which is like this. Could you tell everybody what the book is about so they know whether they want to listen to our conversation?
Yeah, so the book is about basically Barfield's kind of obsession with language, which is an ongoing theme of his work. Is probably the kind of the it's is his focal lens for all of the projects he's kind of doing philosophically is looking through this lens of language. And so the title of the book is called Speaker's Meaning, and what he uses that term to mean is the kind of the differentiation between when I, as a speaker, use a particular word, the reason or the meaning for which I'm grasping and trying to convey, whether poorly or well, as differentiated from what he calls lexical meaning, or like what does that word mean in the dictionary, or what are the groups of things that word symbolizes in the dictionary, and this is probably one of his most shortest books. It's less than 100 pages. It's actually, I think it's comprised of some notes. It's actually verbatim what he said in the lectures when he was here at American University, or it's compiled from the notes he took for those lectures or something like that.
Well, why is language his obsession?
He sees it as like, so his very first book, which he mentions in the first chapter of this, is called History in English Words. And it's funny, I didn't even notice there's a sort of hidden message in that title that I never really caught on to until I was reading this chapter, where basically what he's saying is that within words themselves, there's kind of a history hidden, right? Both there's we look at the phenomenon of words changing, and we just kind of accept it as a sort of fact or a reality, but we don't. What he's interested in is this sort of hidden history that is kind of can be unlocked through that sort of progression in time of how these words kind of trade and both contract and expand meanings over time.
Kind of like an archaeological dig.
Exactly. And I think in that book he talks about, words being kind of fossils of human consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Well, I find this especially interesting when I look at words in scripture, because every once in a while I'll be thinking about something. This morning I was re-listening to one of my episodes with Glenn where we were talking about entropy. And so you have to have heat and cold in order to do work. And Glenn was saying that it's a really good thing that at the beginning of the universe, heat and cold were both very clumpy instead of just distributed evenly and all, losing. So there was power to do work because the heat and the cold were clumpy like that. And all of a sudden came into my mind, Jesus saying, I wish that you were either cold or hot and not lukewarm. And I all of a sudden those words were just invested with new meaning for me, because if you're cold or hot, there's some opportunity available. If you're lukewarm, there's almost no way to reach a person who's lukewarm. You run into people every once in a while who'll say, oh, that's nice for you. And you know what that means is they right. See themselves as a blank slate, a neutral zone. They can
right.
your idea or his
outside
idea.
The frame altogether.
Yeah. It's just like Jordan Peterson says, don't hide unhidden things in the fog. So somebody who's in that neutral zone, it's just like being in the fog. There's no capacity for work or for change to take place without an entry of energy from the outside, whether that's some rock you stumble over or whether it's somebody who comes into your life that grants you some sort of energy so that you can get out of that space.
The anomaly.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, that's kind of the way I think about words, is not only not only the history that's built into the words of how people have used the words over time, but also the deep expressive meaning that is in the words that unlocks to us over time, that we see more and more of as we gain in wisdom and capacity to understand. So, I mean, the word of scripture is that way, certainly. So, one of the things that fascinated me about this chapter, and you may have something else you want to talk about from it, but I wanted to say, first of all, that the thing that has captivated my thinking ever since I started reading this chapter, and it's sort of taken on the role of being a lens through which to see everything in the world, is this quote that he had from the historian Collingwood about the past being reenacted in the mind of the historian and his reader. So he's talking about the fact that historical events, well, two things he said. First of all, historical events are distinguished from natural events by the fact that they have both an inside and an outside. And you know, this inside-outside thing is something that I've been working on for a year at least, as to how it applies to everything. But he also goes on to talk about how historical events have this thing where a historical event can tell you about the people and the things, the events that happened, maybe the order in which they happened. And so that is what you might call the accuracy of the historical telling. But then there is also the underlying thing of what was going on in terms of the surroundings at that time. What was the philosophy? What were the philosophies that were being debated in the public square? What were the political issues related to this that were at least tangential or causative of that event to happen? So then that's the expression, or the I guess communication. He uses accuracy and communication as opposites. Mm-hmm. And that, no, he uses, I get this mixed up now.
You could read the quote from Collingwood.
Yeah, okay. So probably should do that.
You want me to read it?
Yeah.
So this is the one on page 9, I assume, right?
Yes.
What's the big block quote?
Yes. Uh-huh.
So, and this is referring to Collingwood trying to distinguish between the inside and the outside.
Yeah.
So by the outside of an event, I mean everything belonging to it, which can be described in terms of bodies and their movements. The passage of Caesar, accompanied by certain men across a certain river called the Rubicon at one date, or the spilling of his blood on the floor of the Senate House at another. By the inside of an event, I mean that in it, which can only be described in terms of thought, Caesar's defiance of Republican law, which is obviously the crossing of the Rubicon, or the clash of constitutional policy between himself and his assassins.
Yes. So Barfield goes on to describe these two sides as being here it is. Language has two primary functions, one of which is expression and the other communication. They are not the only functions language performs, but they are both indispensable to its existence. The goal to which expression aspires, or the criterion by which it must be measured, is something like fullness or sincerity. The goal toward which communication aspires is accuracy. Both functions must be performed in some degree and at the same time, otherwise there is no language at all. I don't even remember how Barfield connected this up with Collingwood, but in my mind, the idea is that the things that happened, the spilling of the blood, the crossing of the Rubicon, that's an accuracy. That's
what you're doing there is you're making explicit a connection, which I don't think Barfield makes, but I think is helpful. You're making explicit the connection between the outside and accuracy and the inside and expression.
Yes.
I think that's warranted. I think it actually helps connect those parts of the chapter.
And once those tumblers clocked into place for me, I began to see it in terms of everything. Like in art, you have to have both accuracy and expression. If you focus completely on accuracy, the whole painting becomes desiccated. Even if it were possible to be 100% accurate and produce a completely accurate representation of a photograph or a completely accurate representation of a person, by perfectly specifying everything in the image, you would have captured a single moment in time, but you really have no way of knowing whether that is the expressive moment in time of that thing or of that person. You have no way.
What does it mean?
Yeah, there's no meaning in it at all. If you go the other direction with too much expression and no accuracy, then you get fog. It's just, and I think of this in terms of like some of the expressionistic artists, that some of them just get to a point where, oh, well, I can just throw a bunch of paint on a canvas in any old order whatsoever, and somebody will buy it because they're going to think there's, some deep, profound underlying meaning in it. But it really is just stuff thrown at a canvas. There's been no accuracy or intention or focus put into it. And so also there's no meaning. So if you go too far in either direction, you lose the meaning. Somewhere along that sliding scale is where the meaning is. And that would depend completely on the situation.
Yeah, what's interesting too, your framing of this makes me think too that, in some sense, the meaning is always the inside as well, right? So when we think about meaning, it always points to the inside. And the other thing it makes me think is that there's, in some sense, there's always an inside of the inside. Like you realize there's always another layer further in.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Well, so the way Glenn talks about the inside and the outside is one of the very simple examples he uses is a watch. So the inside of the watch is, and I don't want to get into this debate about complicated versus complex. I'm going to use the word complex just because it scales, but probably it's complicated. Anyway, the inside of a gear-driven watch is very complex or complicated mechanism. And it can only be understood, it can only be fixed if you understand the inside, right? But from the outside, the watch is a very simple mechanism. It's got two hands, and the hands are going to keep going around. And if there's no input of energy, eventually those hands will slow down and stop. And then there has to be some outside input of energy, wind up the dial to get the watch going again. So there's this inside that has a lot of complexity, but once you pass this qualitative boundary of the inside and the outside of the watch, now from the outside, the watch can be manipulated or it can be understood in a new way. It has a new use or a new purpose or a new meaning. And sometimes that meaning is not, the meaning might be inside, but the meaning is not evident except from the outside. It'd be like Gödel's theorem, right? Not even if everything is coherent inside the watch, you can't fully understand what the watch is until you get outside the watch. So there's so many things going on in this inside outside thing. But when you think about other, you talked about it scaling all the way down, it also scales all the way up. And the inside and the outside are nested in each other. And where the inside meets the outside, there's an edge, there's a boundary. And in some sense that I haven't quite nailed down yet, all of the creative activity is taking place at the edge.
Mm-hmm. Where those two things interact, right?
Yes.
So there's this, yeah, that's very interesting, because well, and this happens in language too, because there's always in anything I'm saying to you, there's a hidden meaning in everything I'm saying. Just because of the ineffable nature of the things we want to communicate. But I'm always trying to push things kind of past that boundary enough, right? Because I can never do it completely, but I'm trying to get enough of that inside exposed in the outside that I'm giving you, so that you can intuit and infer this much greater insight that if I talk to you for the rest of this hour, I couldn't communicate, right? If I just wrote it down with what Barfield would call as exact accuracy, right? Because what I can describe with exact accuracy is just the relative motion of like fixed bodies in space. It's something like a mathematical language is what would be 100% accurate, right? And if I was to try and describe it that way, I could spend the rest of the life of the universe trying to say what I want to say to you right now, and it couldn't be happening. So like there's this, yeah, there's what's interesting there is there's this sort of there's data compression, but there's also like a forced error. Like there's like it's almost like forced upon us in terms of how we communicate, that we can never. There's always this sort of remove from the thing itself, and strangely enough, that remove is actually productive of creativity, as you were kind of what you were leading into in terms of how you think about your creative process and how creativity happens. It happens at the edge between these two things.
Okay, I'm gonna step in here because something occurred to me when you said that. When I was re-listening to my talk with Glenn, he was talking about entropy being a kind of forgetfulness, that as entropy increases, the capacity to turn back disappears, because you can't get back to where you were because you've lost information about where you were.
Right.
So entropy is a kind of forgetfulness. And that the only way that life can continue is if there is a I can't remember the word he used, but there has to be some sample to go back to that tells you where you were, and that DNA is that sample that you can always get back to that tells you where you were. Because as people age, everything degrades over time, and so there's this forgetfulness of where the system used to be, but the DNA will get the system back where it used to be. And then he said something so interesting. He said, yes, and what makes it even better is that the new DNA comes from both the male and the female, so that there is kind of an automatic error correction system in case one or the other is not good. And all of a sudden I thought, oh, that's exactly what's happening in the brain with the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. It's a kind of an error correction system, automatic error correction system, a kind of non-identical repetition, or a kind of non-identical redundancy that allows a maximum interplay, so that, well,
right, it's oppositional. Like one is seeing the world in one way, one is seeing the other, and they're kind of,
it's an opponent processing.
They're opponent processing. So they're one in both of them, in many different instances, thinks their view is more important or more relevant, and they're kind of fighting it out in some sense. Now, the other thing you said that was really interesting, because you're talking about because it replies to, so this chapter opens with Barfield talking about history and the ways in which our conception of history has changed dramatically in just like the last few centuries. And so, and one of the things that he said, like the ancient view of history, right, has implicit in it this sort of idea that we have fallen from a golden age of the past, and that the process of history is this sort of descent into the entropy you're describing. Like we're forgetting this golden model that we descended from, like when everything was great. And mythology in some sense is an attempt to so mythology and history kind of get intertwined, but it's what you're really trying to do with both of those is you're trying to preserve that golden model that's you're seeing yourself losing. And so it's like you're trying to, it's like culture is trying to create the DNA that's going to be transmitted in the future so we can save this model.
Wow. Yes, right? Yes.
So, but now history's changed where we see ourselves, quote unquote, evolving into this via progress into this idea of the future. And this is one of the things that Barfield so influenced C.S. Lewis on, is C.S. Lewis said, I was guilty of chronological snobbery, where I thought anything newer by necessity was better because I had so imbibed the modern assumptions of progress, where we're, and I've also heard this, in terms of like, there's ways in which we can see, just looking at the structure of DNA over time and the way it's accumulated all these errors, you can look at and say, you could say in some sense we're degrading. DNA is degrading all the time. There's all sorts of errors that are being introduced that actually stay around, and we all have. And that's one of the reasons why you don't want to marry one of your closest relatives, because they're likely to have the same errors you have. And so you don't get that error correction, which is why you're, in some sense, the healthiest populations have other information coming in from other areas. So they're unlikely to have the same errors and they can kind of counteract each other, and the offspring's more likely to be healthy. Whereas if you just like kept a genetic population like stagnant over time, like say like the European dynasties that like they all intermarried, you had all these weird diseases that kept cropping up because over time DNA, even though it is a method of trying to copy things perfectly, it's making errors all the time. But what's funny is in the evolutionary model, these errors lead to us progressing into some, magnificent future of like, where we become like X-Men or like we get superpowers or something like that. Whereas, you can just as easily look at these errors as a degradation.
Wow. Yeah. There's so many connections there. I don't even know where to.
I know.
I'm going to turn off my phone here for a second, so I don't end up getting distracted again. Okay, so you mentioned the modern assumption of progress, always progressing, and that makes me think of, so in the Jordan Peterson, John Vervaeke conversation, they were having this discussion about Philia Sophia and Philia Nikeia, the love of wisdom versus the love of victory. And they were seeing those two as being opposites, that you should want the one and not the other. And I think that's an incomplete analogy.
Both opposites, but also one could work into the other. I mean, I think
did they
in that conversation, Peterson seemed to want to make them opposites, but I think Vervaeke kind of pointed it back to actually like something that starts as Philo Nikeia actually can move into Philo Sophia, like with the wrestling model, right? Like at the beginning, you're just wrestling to win. But then at some point, because you're with an opponent that's so well matched to you, you became enthralled with the actual kind of meta process of what you're doing in this dance of the wrestle.
Yes. But aren't there also times when the desire to win or the possibility of success is a positive. I mean, competition works its way. Competition can have very positive attributes.
Yeah.
Because that's, opponent processing is how we learn, right? So, but that made me also think about the other side, this philia sophia, the love of wisdom. It depends on what your love. Are you loving wisdom for itself because of the inherent beauty, goodness, and truth in wisdom, or are you loving wisdom for what it can do for you?
Yeah.
Which that is, that's the picture of, Jordan Peterson said, Philia Sophia and Philia Nikeia are the picture of Cain and Abel, or of Abel and Cain.
Mm-hmm.
But Philia Sophia, the good and bad, it's also a picture of Adam and Eve, but Philia Sophia, the good and bad sides of that possibility are also Adam and Eve. Because if you love wisdom for what it can do for you, if you love wisdom, if you want to grab wisdom for yourself, because it's going to make you godlike, if you want the knowledge of good and evil so that you can be like God, and then that's what Jordan Peterson was talking about as the ill-gotten gains in Cain and Abel. Cain wanted to get God's approval for himself, and so he killed Abel. So he's trying to get it through ill-gotten gains, in the same way that Eve was trying to get the knowledge of good and evil through ill-gotten gains by just taking it for herself instead of waiting for God's perfect timing and God's gift of it to her. So I think that when you talk about the love of wisdom, you have to think of it from the standpoint of the beauty, goodness, and truth of wisdom that draws us, that brings out the desire.
Yeah.
Because it's the desire that, one of the things Glenn mentioned was that success is failure upon failure with undiminished enthusiasm. And that's like a baby or a child. They're willing to fail and fail and fail with undiminished enthusiasm because of the desire to get to the goal. But here's where you come, the goal can't just be accuracy. The goal has to also be expression. And so Barfield was connecting communication with accuracy and expression with fullness or sincerity. So if my brain just goes into paradigms too much, I know, but let's think of communication as being a vertical axis. Communication from God to us and communication from us to God is the vertical axis. And then that's a matter of accuracy, right? Because that's us trying to line up to the map. That's us trying to fit the parameters of the map. Vervaeke and Peterson were talking about the map and the territory. We're trying to line up to the territory through the only map that we have, which is incomplete.
Yep.
And then there is the expression, which is the fullness or the sincerity, which can only be realized in community. Because I am both an inside and an outside. I'm very complex inside, but my outside can communicate with other people, or my outside can communicate with other people via the social structure. So we can work together, we can serve one another without fully knowing what's inside of each other, because there's no way we can fully know what's inside of each other. So the communication or the accuracy is this vertical, and the expression is this outward movement through community. And the intersection of accuracy and expression, or of communication and expression, which is the intersection of accuracy and fullness or sincerity, that's the cross. That's Jesus. He is the intersection. He's the the perfect balance of perfect accuracy and perfect expression. But that word expression is got, I mean, so much depth underneath it, right? And so does
It
accuracy.
does.
So
So what you're kind of doing, you're linking accuracy with philonikia, right?
oh no,
Being
I wasn't, but that's
really,
interesting.
oh really, that's what I was hearing. Sorry.
No,
So
but that's so fascinating because that's the whole thing of striving for the ideal, right?
right,
The
great. Because
ideal
you
is
want
the
you want to be
judge.
as close as possible in, and you, and in the modernist frame, right? We this plays itself out with having the right propositions, having a better formulated testable hypothesis, right? That's a
Mhm.
little bit marginally better than your opponents, and being able to demonstrate that in some form of either argument or some sort of like form of action, right? And winning. But then there's this other thing, which I think the philosophia is the expression, which is to say there's some fullness behind all this, that really the accuracy has to be in some is only some sort of icon of, right? And so it would, to whatever degree it maps onto it, it is just the map, right? And you need to, so see, what I like about his formulation here is when he talks about language and accuracy versus expression, what he's saying is that these two things are always have to be together. You can't pull them apart. If you had 100% accuracy but no expression, all you could talk about is like where bodies are in space. Like you would lose this richness. You would, and he even makes the claim that if this was what language was, just full accuracy, you would never have anything new to talk about,
Mhm.
period. Right?
Mhm.
Which is a bold claim, but I think warranted if you take his claims about language seriously, and to their logical end. But then he says, expression is, if you had somebody that was 100% expression but had no accuracy, it would be like, his example is like a bad poet, right? Somebody that has an enormous lived experience and has like this really breadth of reading and ability to observe the natural world and has all these great um, observations to share, but isn't able to formulate them such that anybody else but himself is able to partake in it. So he's like, that would be a maximum of expression but no accuracy. And so we always need both. So just like Philo-Nicaea and Philosophia, that are never really absent from each other. They're that one is always moving into the other, and you're always making choices at different points to go one direction versus the other. But obviously there's something higher or better about Philosophia because it points towards the fullness. And so you're always, no matter, you have to kind of turn this sort of left brain way and actually take notice of where something here is more accurate in this formulation versus that formulation. But if you lose track of the fact that it's supposed to point to this higher, fuller thing, then you've lost the whole point, and you just lose the track of meaning altogether.
Mhm. Yeah. But what I'm thinking is that there's a big thought rumbling around in here. So when it comes out, it's going to be very imperfectly expressed. The philia sophia, or the love of wisdom can really only be gained because of the limitations right now of who we are and the way the universe is. We can't gain wisdom directly from the source. The only way we can gain wisdom now is through lived experience and through interaction with other people and interaction with God's word and interaction with the way God's word reflects, embodies reality. And so as we reflect on God's word and then we act out our belief in the truth of it through our experience in a lived community, that's when the wisdom begins to grow.
Yeah.
Because
When you said
knowledge
limitations,
knowledge
sorry.
builds up, but knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And love has to be acted out in community.
Yeah, I think that's good. When you're saying limitations, I'm also hearing imperfections. But what I'm also reading from this whole dialogue is that these imperfections are not only necessary, but they're actually an integral part of something, of making something better in total, which is I think what you're kind of gesturing towards with the love and the community element. There's something about a maximizing of beauty that is actually requires these limitations / imperfections.
Well, yes. I mean, even if you look scientifically, you can't have a lessening of a decrease of entropy without disequilibrium. So when everything is at perfect equilibrium, entropy is at its maximum. So there's no more available work. There's no more potential for creativity. Mm-hmm. But the potential for creativity requires disequilibrium. And disequilibrium is a kind, you could say it's a kind of imperfection. I mean, from the scientist's point of view, where everything has to be specifiable and specified, then you could say disequilibrium is kind of disconcerting, because disequilibrium not only means potential, but it also means, it can mean randomness, it can mean unpredictability. And all of those things mean that you can't specify everything. So when I think about this whole thing about total accuracy, that would be when everything is specified. And if everything is specified and separated, then that also is like maximum entropy. There's no more potential there. There's no more work to be done, so to speak.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So one of the things that occurs to me as well is that a conversation like the one we're having right now is actually better in some respects because of our limitations and our lack of knowledge about the subject matter that we're striving towards. Which is a weird thing to say, right? Because you think, well, what we really want is the artist who has his paintings hanging in the Louvre, and if you want to connect that to Barfield, well, we want the Barfield scholar par excellence, and they're going to have a conversation. And I'm like, I actually think that I wouldn't be interested in that conversation. And this also kind of, like, I was telling somebody this the other day, relating back to when you first started your channel and you were having those conversations with Alex, and I first started commenting on your videos, and how, I guess conceptually I could see, like, you had your sphere of knowledge over here, and Alex had his little sphere of knowledge over here, and you had the barest of connection points. And so you both had to be incredibly patient with one another to try and increase the size of that overlap and get your different thoughts into a shared space together. And for me, so your limitations there for me made it so much easier to see I said at the time, I said, I could tell God was in the conversation, or the logos was present in that conversation in ways I was able to see that I wouldn't have been able to see where I could attribute it all to, like, I don't know, some sort of human knowledge or wisdom or whatever like that, like where I could see just how all the connection points happen. I found it really transforming and amazing to watch something come to life that was, in some sense, wasn't either of your creation, although you were participating with it, if that makes sense. I don't know if that came through at all well, but for me, as a third party observer, I don't know if you were aware of it, while you're doing it, but like, for me, it was just obvious, like, something that wasn't here previously now exists. And that was really incredible to watch. And it's what kind of motivates me to be a part of these conversations, even though I feel like I do such a horrible job, or like I feel like I don't have much to contribute. I still see how the limitations are actually part of how things are helped forward in some strange way.
Well, because here's a perfect example where all the creative potential is happening at the edge between the two of us. Because you've got this edge, which is your limitation. I've got my edge, which is my limitation. And those two edges are bumping up against each other, seeking a way through so that we can understand each other at a
Mhm.
deeper and deeper level. And all the creative potential is happening right there, because creativity rides that wave between, well, it rides the wave. Jordan Peterson talks about the wave between order and chaos, and that the hero rides that wave between so that he can reach over into chaos and gather what's there and bring it back to correct what's gone wrong in order. But I think there's also a sense in which any two things that come together, there's an edge that's created where there's potential for creativity. And even when things are nested inside of each other, that edge is the edge between the thing and the background of the thing. If you think of the larger thing being the background of the smaller thing, then that's also where this potential for creativity lies. And then that goes all the way up, and you can see that all the way through everything in physics. And the other day I ran into a paper. Well, actually, I'd run into it a few years ago, but I hadn't taken the time to go back and look at it again. But a paper that Jordan Peterson wrote much earlier in his career on using entropy as a way of describing what happens in behavioral psychology when a person is beset by uncertainty and anxiety, using entropy as a measure. And in that, he had actually gone into some of Carl Friston's research and understood all about dissipative, I can't remember the terminology, but the kind of the stuff that John Vervaeke was talking about the other day, as though Jordan Peterson didn't know about it. But Jordan Peterson had written this paper like 10 years ago, exploring all these ideas. Very interesting. And I want to dig into it some more and maybe find a psychologist to talk.
Yeah, you have to share a link to that in the video notes.
Oh, that's a good idea. Yeah, I'll link to the psychology paper. And all the way through it, I kept seeing this thing also of the whole accuracy and expression. I don't know what you would call that. It's not exactly a binary, is it?
He calls it a polarity.
A polarity.
Right. And as distinct from a paradox is like these two opposites that are kind of logically contradicting each other. Whereas he's saying this polarity is something where these two entities exist by virtue of one another, right? So that like the two poles of an electrical magnet, you can't have the negative side of the pole of the magnet without the positive. And the two are in some sense competitive, because getting more a charge in one way is moving the pole away from the other. But even if it's being pulled away, its reference point for its continued strength is still held in its completion by the other pole of the magnet. So it's like when he talks about it here, I think he calls expression and accuracy sweet enemies, because in some sense you're always being, there's the push towards one versus the other, but the other can't exist without the other one being in place. Like you can't, the one's success depends intricately on the other.
Well, so do you think that it would be a good way of describing what John Vervaeke is trying to get at when he talks about dialogos?
I think so. I think because I think he's what he means and is gesturing towards is this moreness, this inexhaustibleness, which again, I mean, I tend to, everything for me collapses back into these data compression motifs where I see that these limitations give us all ways of lensing holographically like these larger realities. And so which is part of why, like, again, a conversation like ours can be can illuminate things that literally couldn't be illuminated by any other two persons in the history of the world,
Well, so
but are real realities.
the dialogos is the logos in you attempting to communicate with the logos in me. Is that?
Yeah. And so for me, what I see there is an expression of the infinite manifesting itself in the finite, right? At a particular time and place, and coming into some real embodied existence.
Well, one of the things Jordan Peterson said that I felt like I wanted to disagree with, and I don't quite know how to put it into words, but he said that his description of love, his definition of love, is the best in me loving the best in you. And I thought,
serving the best in you,
serving the best in me, serving the best in you.
There's a lot of judgment in that.
Yeah, well, first of all, there is no best in me aside from God in me. So I could say the love poured into me through the love of God, that God has filled me with his love, that love can reach out and serve you as you are, even where there is no best in you, but can also posit the hopeful vision of who you will be when you're complete in Christ, and love that person. And through loving that person, actually help you move to that place. And so that, to me, that is more what love is, that when my husband loves me, when he speaks truth to me, because he sees places where I'm not reaching that potential of where I could be, he's loving me where I am, but he's also loving me into that place that I could be or will be someday. And there's a whole lot, there's a big gap in there where a whole lot of other things are happening. But to me, that's a much fuller expression of love than to say that the best in me is serving the best in you.
Yeah.
Because that sort of demands that in order to love
yeah. Viktor Frankl has a quote on this, on love, that I always reference quite a bit. He says, love is the only way to grasp another human being in the innermost core of his personality. I just thought that inner was interesting. No one can become fully aware of the very essence of another human being unless he loves him. By his love, he is enabled to see the essential traits and features in the beloved person. And even more, he sees that which is potential in him, which is not yet actualized, but yet ought to be actualized. Furthermore, by his love, the loving person enables the beloved person to actualize these potentialities. By making him aware of what he can be and of what he should become, he makes these potentialities come true.
Wow. He said it way better. But yeah, that's the idea. I mean, that's the...
It's funny to me, in its simplest form, I think...
Can you link to that quote?
Yeah.
Okay, send me the link to that quote.
But like in its simplest form, John was talking about in that following that conversation about, the grasping of the cup, right? Mm-hmm. My hand conforms to the cup. I think that's love at its most basic level. It's an attention first and foremost, but it's an attention that accommodates itself to the thing being addressed. So that, when I think about love, I think about it kind of in levels, and where the highest level of love is where the two things become one, right? And you can see that in a sort of superficial way when I'm doing it with a cup, but we can imagine that if what we are as persons is this sort of kind of network of things that has boundaries that are actually outside of just my physical body, that somehow we can be coming into union with these larger realities. And I would speculate, or I would say, like, I think this is just the case that whether we realize it or not, we're actually becoming into union with these realities all the time, whether we recognize it or not.
Okay, so grasping the cup, the attention that accommodates itself to the thing expressed, that is the accuracy of grasping, the attentional focus required to grasp. That's the left hemisphere. And that's the accuracy. And then the making space for the thing grasped, that
right, which is a feminine action, right? Because this can't change. So, but I can.
This is why I think left and right hemispheres map onto masculine and feminine. But McGilchrist absolutely refuses to say that left and right hemispheres map onto male and female. But I think there's a difference between masculine and feminine, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, masculine and male are two different things.
Agreed.
Right. And so there's masculine and feminine in both men and in women, because the left hemisphere maps onto masculine, the right hemisphere maps onto feminine. And so this grasping is making space. It's the focal point, the attentional focus, the accuracy. And then the other side of it is the making space, which is the expressive aspect. And the expressive aspect is attempting to attain fullness and sincerity, according to Barfield. And that fullness and sincerity is conforming oneself truly to the thing that's being grasped. Okay, not just partially conforming, but true. That fullness and sincerity is really that kind of a grasp. In the same way that, like, a woman's body prepares itself for the baby in the womb, you're full.
Creates the space.
Yes, makes the space and prepares the space, and that space is prepared to nurture and all of that. So, but grasping a cup is one thing. Grasping an idea is another thing. You can grasp an idea with accuracy, but if you're not also grasping it with expression, you're not making place inside you where all those other aspects of your, what I like to call your experiential DNA, but I guess Vervaeke calls it relevance realization, but all those things in you that connect to everything that you hear and learn and think about, you have to make space inside yourself for that idea, which is Peterson's idea of letting something die so that something new can come in. So that making space is an act of sacrifice. There's something there that the express.
Well, I think a big part of the sacrifice is a sort of loss of identity. You lose a little bit of your identity and take on a little bit of the identity of the thing you're loving.
Okay, so identity somehow maps onto boundary, because living entities in a sense create their own boundaries. Out of the center of the living entity, the extent of the boundary is defined. I mean, on a simplistic level, a cell gets to a certain size and stops because it's supposed to be a certain size. So there's, it could be the telos of the cell to get to a certain size, but whatever it is, there's something inside the cell that tells it what its boundary is going to be. So the identity of the cell is bound up with the boundary of the cell. And I forget what you just said now about identity, but it strikes me that there's some interface there.
Yeah, and some of what this does for me, it gets into I don't know if I think you've been talking to Nate about his kind of personalist ontology.
Mm-hmm. Trying to understand why he is so adamant about using the word personal rather than individual. Yes. Right.
And it's because of this idea of the person as somebody that, in some sense, there's this extension of the line of the human, like that actually goes into other people, right? So like in some sense, you think about your children, obviously there's like physical aspects of who you are that are present in them, but even more so, you think about what a person is, and how what we think of as the identity of a person is really takes place at this story layer, and how that story layer is always being impacted by other people. This is part of the argument too. I don't know if we've ever talked about this, but David Henley Hart's book, that all shall be saved. His arguments for universalism are based on this personalism too, where in some sense, it's very difficult. It's difficult for a father to be quote unquote saved if his son's in hell, because in some sense, there's like the son and him in some sense are connected in these very deep ways. So to have a father in heaven and a son in hell in some sense is to make the father into some other thing, so that he doesn't have these deep connections into that. I don't know, I'm not explaining it well, but suffice it to say, the idea is more that think of humanity more as this one living organism, that has causal connections going back and forward in time in all directions in some sense. So we're like a net of causal things rather than what we think of as individuals. Now, at the individual layer, there's some sort of seat of decision making and consciousness that we identify with a person, but even that's unclear, which is why you have like Sam Harris's of the world that think we're completely determined, because so much of what I'm saying to you now doesn't come out of like, it's sort of, it sort of just comes to me, right? Because it's built into all these layers of my personhood that I don't even have access to, right? But I'm somehow marshaling them together, all these, like your experiential DNA that you talked about, everything I've been in that's built into me, and somehow, Paul calls it the consciousness congress, like calls for my attention in this moment to be brought forward to the stage right now. It's a very complex web, and we simplify it, because that's what we do in the modernist frame. Everything is simplified and distinguished from other pieces, right? We mentally distinguish things into concepts as a way to causally understand the way the world works, but that mental distinction doesn't actually create a new identity in the way we think it does. Like these things are still very much wrapped up with each other, if that makes sense.
What jumped into my mind immediately was when God asked Adam to name the animals. By naming the animals, by giving them, by using his thought to give them an identity from his perspective, that doesn't change the identity of who the animal is, right? Mm-hmm. So specify, even if we specify or categorize something into a category, we're not fundamentally changing the thing. We're only changing our categorical system.
Yeah, but in some sense, you do like that name change, or that name, it does now participate with the future reality of what that thing becomes. So it has like it does have this causal action. Yes, because once something is put into a categorical system, it changes the way people think about it. This is the big problem. This is one of the big problems that jumps to mind, is identity politics. Because if you specify that people exist within a certain frame and they're not permitted to be outside that frame, and you're doing that in order to make that group of people easier to deal with, because you've now stepped outside the group. Actually, within the group of those people, there's a lot of complexity and many different types of people and ideas and everything else. It allows you to maintain a simpler model of the world.
Yeah. But you've also, now that you have specified that and it becomes a part of the culture, that's going to have massive impact on the future, not only on the way the future views that group of people, but on the way those people themselves view each other, and the way people outside the group view them. It has this causal effect going on into the future, because you have incorrectly categorized Yeah, that's
So the key word for this personal ontology is participation, which is Barfield's word. So I think it's apropos what we're talking about.
well, I wanted to ask you before we talk about participation, I wanted to ask you, is it Barfield that talks about seeing as being a gathering? I've been thinking about that lately and I can't remember where I read it, but this idea of, is that the baby?
No, it's my dog.
Oh,
She's she's so odd. I mean, she
she sounds
Stephanie,
like
you're
a
snoring
baby.
loud. She's man, she gets in my office every day, and if the door's not open, she'll pound on the door until I let her in.
Well,
Um,
the noise doesn't bother me. It just sounds like a baby in the background as long as it doesn't
um,
bother you.
no, somebody brought that forward recently. The Gathering. Ah, man.
Yeah, who was it that talks about that? Was that Mark Vernon, maybe? In which case, it probably was Barfield anyway.
No, I just came across this recently. Now I've lost it. I feel like somebody quoted it in one of the Boxer threads I was part of, but I can't. Yeah, I'll look. I'll find it and send it to you. We can link it at the bottom.
I think there's something really important in that, and in many ways. I mean, part of it is that first of all, we're seeing through our own lens, and so what we're gathering is idiosyncratic to me because I'm gathering through my own lens. But the kind of attentional focus that I put on my seeing is also going to change what gets gathered, what gets curated, and this relates to scientists and the way that they approach something. They might think that they're using the scientific method to attain a certain level of some aspect of truth that they're after, but they're choosing. This is what gets. I mentioned to you before we started this little clip of Jonathan Pageau where he's talking about how everything stems from these kinds of choices, that a story in scripture isn't the literal meaning of the story, because there is no possibility for a literal meaning, because every aspect of any story is those details that were chosen by the person telling the story, and the person telling the story has a purpose or a meaning in the story. So those are the details that were chosen to tell that story. And that's the attentional focus. Jordan Peterson talks about how when we're standing at the edge of the future, that we're looking out over a field of infinite potential, and it's whatever our attentional focus. If our attentional focus is on the highest possible good, then what will come into our field of vision are those things that are going to help us organize our future in a way that is positive. So it's the kind of attentional focus that we bring to bear that's going to knit together these things.
Yeah. And the metaphysical claim there is that there is this other entity that manifests itself when you do that, right? That helps knit and shape things together in constructive ways, even though you have all these limitations and imperfections that would seem to make it nearly impossible for you to do anything in a constructive fashion with this larger tapestry of a whole, that somehow something actually cooperates and participates with you as you participate with it.
Well, Jordan Peterson, I think, is linking that back to the collective unconscious of history, of all the organisms that have ever existed,
right
into history, and the books in the library behind you, that is what, that if you fix your gaze on the highest good, that's what's organizing your movement forward. But I just don't see how that can be. I mean,
well,
I think there has
I can kind of see it like
above and beyond that.
if you think about Jordan Peterson's project, part of it is to try and see how far he can go from these sort of materialist, evolutionary, finite frame, and see how much being very rigorous and staying with that frame while also taking very seriously all these religious stories and all this wisdom of the past. How can he connect those two things together without stepping into this other metaphysical space, right? Of positing, something outside of the frame. And I think that is really effective. I mean, there's something useful in that. Also, sometimes I don't know, in my stranger moments of like just reflecting on these things, this is complete heresy, but it's just a thought that enters my mind sometimes, that maybe in some sense God does embed himself into this world in a way that is so hidden and distinct that it is almost like this sort of, I don't know, like in some sense, it is as if he is so enveloped in and cooperated with and participated with the creation that in some sense that is the means whereby he makes himself present now to us. And in some sense, this is just one way of looking at it. This is kind of more of a sort of process theology way of looking at things, which again, I feel like there's something interesting it has to contribute. I don't think it's the whole, but it's almost, what I find interesting about it is this idea that God in some sense entrusts himself into the hands of men in some real ways, so that we have real ontological consequences for the decisions we're making that get written onto the way the story fits itself in at the end. Not to say that there aren't limits and boundaries and things that ensure that it will always get to where it's supposed to go, but the particular way that unfolds is actually very deeply impacted by what we're doing here and now.
So the thing that comes to my mind, Jordan Peterson always says you should say whatever comes into your mind when you're talking to somebody. And what comes into my mind is this discussion we were having about entropy again, that when order is being created, if it is an imperfect process, which it always is, because of the nature of the universe, because of our nature, when we're creating order, we can never do it perfectly. And because it's an imperfect process, more entropy than there's an eventual increase in entropy caused by the creation of order. So the universe as a whole is increasing in entropy all the time, and the creation of order is actually causing a more increase in entropy than if there was no creation of order. Right? So the universe is somehow, and I'm using the word universe loosely, the universe is somehow willing to accept increasing entropy in order that order might be created. And I think there's something very fundamental there. And so I've been thinking about time, space-time, and time and space. Space-time is one thing, but because I always think in paradigms, and I've been thinking about time as accuracy, because time at the beginning of the universe, before space and time, so then there's the singularity, and change begins to happen. The Big Bang, change begins to happen. That change is time, right? Time and change are pretty much the same thing. So that change is based on extremely finely tuned, accurate physical laws. And so that's this time moving, this change is moving through with these very accurate physical laws of perfect accuracy, of such beauty. But the expression is the expansion of space as time moves. So time is this axis, and space is this increasing boundary. The boundary continues to increase over time. When boundaries increase, that's creating more space inside of the thing, right? So you have
possibilities.
You have this arrow of time, which can only go one direction because entropy is increasing. Change can only go one direction because entropy is increasing, because there is an increasing forgetfulness. I want to hold that thought about increasing forgetfulness while the boundary is increasing. So there's more and more space for, on the one hand, for more order to be created as galaxies form and stars and chemical elements and all that needs more and more space for these things to be created. Even knowing that at a certain point, as with increasing space, there's increasing room for disorder. But going back to the forgetfulness thing, one of the things Glenn made me aware of in a email the other day is that when you're painting a painting, forgetfulness is essential, or you can never complete a painting, meaning that there are times that you have to change something or paint over something or erase something as you're moving. And what that is a kind of forgetfulness, that if forgetfulness is not possible, then there's also no potential for change.
Interesting.
So change requires forgetfulness. So there's something very deep underneath that. He was joking around and he said, if you can figure out what is the purpose of entropy, he said, you'll have a Nobel Prize. So that's what I'm shooting for.
Wow. Well, so this kind of aligns with something I was thinking about the other day. First of all, I want to point out, like, there's a book we're reading right now, me and Nate and Sherry, on the Book of Revelation, which is a very, very interesting book by Emil Bach. And one of the things they say in there is space, or time becomes space over time, which to me is a very strange thing, but aligns with that arrow you were describing of we're starting really small, and over time, like, time is literally becoming space. Like, the space is getting larger and larger. The whole universe we know is expanding, and it's actually accelerating its expansion, which is a weird thing, but it's becoming space, which is strange, which means entropy is going up. This space for possibilities is going up all the time. And it's weird, like, linking this to the order. So I had this thought the other day about why is pain necessary? And what I kind of conceptualize is it's actually a way of maximizing the good in a certain sense, because let's just say there's only like a sort of finite amount of good that could be experienced, even if it's arbitrarily large. It's very limited in terms of like how much good could be experienced without imperfections or some introduction of this noise or this imperfection. But somehow when the imperfections are allowed into the equation, like, it's like this exponential amount of possible good goes up dramatically, because because there's something about this sort of variety and non-identical replication that is fundamentally good. We recognize there's something good in it. There's something we want to keep something of the pattern, but we also want to see it improved in some way, and somehow that requires this introduction of pain. And so what I was thinking about was, in some sense, the creation is always asking this sort of question of humans about where we play this decisive role about, to some extent, like what amount of pain and suffering is tolerable. In what sense, how far can we go into the pain and suffering and even of our own lives say it was good in spite of all that. Like we're in some sense providing a real answer to that question all the time with how we act and what we do. And somebody was talking about this. There's some book about saying no to God, and I don't know anything about the book. It's just in the backdrop, but I think in some sense that's kind of what we're doing. We're kind of like, even in our prayer life to some extent, we're kind of drawing a line to around like how much of this ontological weight of suffering can we take onto ourselves individually. And in some sense, every bit we take onto ourselves is like some bit that somebody else doesn't have to take on in a real way. And I don't know how that's possible, but I think that's really true. And it's funny because you're talking about forgetfulness too, because I think, I think regret is like the ultimate punishment for anything. Like it's like regret is the worst of all things, right? And Jesus, in his descriptions of what we think of as hell, he talks about this weeping and gnashing of teeth, and this sort of this ultimate regret. And I don't know. I feel like, because I'm finding myself more and more persuaded of certain universalist arguments, while at the same time thinking there has to be very clear, there's some real thing to be fearful of in terms of this regret. And I don't know how to get those two to talk to each other, but I can't really let go of either one.
Well, I'm going to toss out two things. The first is there's something about regret. If regret is the ultimate punishment, then Jordan Peterson was talking about resentment being the ultimate. I don't know if he said sin. He didn't say sin. The only word that sprang to my mind is obstacle. Resentment, the scripture says, do not let the bitter root of resentment grow in you, right?
Right.
So I'm just going to leave that there, and you can contemplate that for our next talk. But I want to go
There's something about forgiveness, that you have to forgive to be forgiven.
Yes. Yeah. I was, somebody had tweeted the other day about Simone Weil's statement that every prayer is present in the Lord's Prayer. And that if you take it apart and really meditate on each word and contemplate each word, you will see that every prayer is present there. So I took the time that morning to just go through and spend about a half an hour on the Lord's Prayer, looking at each word and writing out what occurred to me. And yeah, there's a universe in the Lord's Prayer. It's very interesting. And part of that is you have to forgive in order to be forgiven. And that goes back to the whole meaning of the word forgive, which is to permit or to suffer. Go back and look at the meaning of the word forgive in that verse. There's a whole library of depth in there.
What's the underlying word?
Well, I'm going to let you go. I have to get ready for my talk.
Okay. Oh yeah. I'm sorry.
Right. So but that's homework, right? We're going to look at regret and resentment and forgiveness. And, but I wanted to go back to the statement you made about saying no to God, because when you said that, immediately what sprang to mind for me is 1988. I've been grieving over my brother's death in a fiery plane crash and trying to understand how the universe works, because my brother had always been very opposed to the reality of God and opposed to the gospel. And I had regrets because I had so many discussions with him that were really about trying to win the battle, but at the same time I was losing the war. And just trying to understand all of that. So I was going through this period of intense suffering, at the same time trying to learn Japanese, trying to adapt to the Japanese culture, seeing some things in my marriage that didn't make sense to me. All of this stuff was happening at once. And I was reading the scripture that morning in 1988, and it came upon, I believe it's Philippians 2:10. Lord, that I might know you and the power of your resurrection.
And the fellowship of your sufferings too, right?
Yes, but my temptation was to stop there, because when I looked at the second half of the verse, I said no to God. I said, I can't handle any more suffering. And a year later, I revisited that verse. And at that point, I said yes to God. I said, I want you more than I want to say no to you about this. And it was very soon after that my husband revealed to me that he was gay and that he was leaving me. And I came back to the United States to find my mother dying of cancer and walking my father through his final days a month after my mother died. And even then, I was aware that there was some kind of a deepening process going on, that there was some kind of an emptying out of self so that there would be more room for Christ. So, but none of that would have been possible without the communion of the saints, without the community of the body of Christ gathering around me and strengthening me and encouraging me and walking me through that and praying for me. So that's the expression. See, the body of Christ is the expression, but somehow that communication, accuracy of communication, of finding true meaning and true depth requires a digging out, an excavating, a cleaning out the wound, so to speak. There has to be more space made in us for Christ to dwell in. And Christ can only dwell in a place. He makes space for himself, and the space he's making for himself is I hate to say this, but it's kind of like a purified space. Somewhere inside the big mess that I am, there is a space that is purified enough for him to dwell. Yeah. Kind of like the Holy of Holies in the temple, right? You start in the outer courts, and then you move towards the Holy of Holies. Well, most of me is the outer courts where all the riffraff are hanging out. But Christ, through suffering, I think he carves out something of that inner space where he can dwell. So we're going to stop. We're going to stop there, and let's do this again.
Yeah, this was great.
Okay. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye, Karen.